Hello and welcome to The Search. I'm Shahid Jurgen. In this lesson, we're going to cover a trio of Psalms, each of which contributes to one of the most significant themes in all of Scripture. We're going to try to answer the question, who can be in God's presence, as this question is discussed in Psalms 15, 16, and 17. Now, in the beginning, God created a sacred space called the Garden of Eden. The whole world belonged to the Lord, yet on the earth, one location was set apart as the place where God and his image bearers could dwell together. He crowned the humans with glory and honor, putting everything under their feet and granting them the right to rule over the work of his hands, according to Psalm 8, verses 5 and 6. Eden was a paradise. It's described in Genesis 2 with terms often associated with God's blessings, like flowing rivers of water, precious stones and gold, animals of all kinds. And in the middle of the garden, humans encountered the tree of life. Yahweh took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it, Genesis 2:15. Psalm 8 says the humans were kings and queens over the earth, but they were also ministers in God's sanctuary, serving him in his sacred space. Sin, however, changed everything. Adam and Eve rebelled against the authority of their Creator when they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The consequences for their sin culminated in expulsion from God's presence. So Yahweh, God, banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken, and he drove the man out. He placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life, Genesis 3:23 and 24. From that moment onward, God has sought to re-establish his dwelling place with his image bearers. But sin continues to thwart God's will. King David knew that humanity lost much after sin entered the world. Psalm 8 is David's reflection on the world as it was originally created and as it should still be. David's desire was to enjoy God's presence, just as Adam and Eve had experienced it in Eden. But the king knew the extreme difficulty involved in being in the presence of God. Psalms 15, 16, and 17 are thematically tied together. These psalms, though different in many respects, discuss the desperate need humans have to be with God. They ponder who is qualified to be in God's sacred spaces. They rejoice in the knowledge that God will bless even the dead with the reward of his presence, and they long to finally and fully see God's face. So let's start with Psalm 15. Now, the previous psalm, Psalm 14, which we discussed in our last lesson, we learned that that was a poem of instruction about the fool who lives life without taking God's instruction to heart. Psalm 14 and Psalm 15 don't really fit into the main or major psalm genres. They're more like teaching psalms meant to impart some kind of lesson. The lesson of Psalm 14, our last psalm, was that fools who live life as if there is no God will be overwhelmed with dread when they realize that Yahweh is in the presence or the company of the righteous, and they find themselves on the outside. In the next psalm, the one we'll discuss now, David continues to contemplate the question about who can actually be in God's presence. All right, let's read it now. Psalm 15, a psalm of David. Yahweh, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The one whose walk is blameless, who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbor and casts no slur on others, who despises a vile person but honors those who fear Yahweh, who keeps an oath even when it hurts and does not change their mind, who lends money to the poor without interest, who does not accept a bribe against the innocent, Whoever does these things will never be shaken. Now you notice both of these expressions in the first verse of the psalm, sacred tent and holy mountain. These are significant expressions. They're used in other places in the Hebrew Bible to describe those sacred spaces where God dwells, such as the tabernacle and the Jerusalem temple. In fact, the Garden of Eden is referred to as the holy mount of God in Ezekiel 28 and verse 14. These are all places where God lived and dwelt. But the question posed by David assumes, of course, that God is already there and wants to know, well, who else is welcome? Who else can be in those spaces? Now, the question of being welcome into God's presence is not new in the Psalter. In one of his prayers for deliverance, David wrote this, "For you are not a God who is pleased with wickedness. With you, evil people are not welcome. The arrogant cannot stand in your presence." Psalm 5, verses 4 and 5. So if those are the kinds of people who are excluded, then who is included? Who is welcome? Well, David offers 11 answers to the question. Most of these are in the form of parallel groupings of two, and this is how Golden Gay very briefly summarizes them. These are the general integrity of the person in relation to other people in the community, the equivalent lack of wrong actions towards others, the response to people's stance in relation to Yahweh, and the right attitude toward money. Well, that's basically what these qualities are about. In fact, you might essentially say that the qualifications, if we could call them that, for being in God's presence is that one must be the opposite of the enemies of David described in earlier lament psalms, or the opposite of the wicked fool discussed in Psalm 14. David's enemies were those who lied, slandered, did violence, rejected Yahweh. The blameless and righteous people of Psalm 15 are the exact opposite kind of David's enemies. Their virtue, their love for God, and their willingness to help their neighbors is patently manifest each and every day. David closes by affirming that all who do these things will never be shaken. But what exactly does he mean by that? I mean, David has already prayed for God to deliver the righteous from oppression, and certainly David's laments demonstrate that even the most dedicated of Yahweh's followers often experience shakenness or instability. How can David claim an unshaken life for the righteous? Well, it's interesting that the meaning of this final line in Psalm 15 is explored, or we might say unpacked further in the next psalm, Psalm 16. And we see in this the beautiful and wonderful compilation of the Psalter as it now exists in the form that we have it today, how many of these psalms are coupled and grouped together in such a deliberate and meaningful way. So let's talk about Psalm 16. We'll start now by reading it, a miktam of David, verse 1. Keep me safe, my God, for in you I take refuge. I say to Yahweh, you are my Lord. Apart from you, I have no good thing. I say of the holy people who are in the land, they are the noble ones in whom is all my delight. Those who run after other gods will suffer more and more. I will not pour out libations of blood to such gods, or take up their names on my lips. Yahweh, you alone are my portion and my cup. You make my lot secure. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. I praise Yahweh who counsels me. Even at night, my heart instructs me. I keep my eyes always on Yahweh. With him at my right hand, look at this line, I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest secure, because you will not abandon me in the realm of the dead, nor will you let your faithful one or your holy one see decay. You make known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. Where Psalm 15 was a poem of contemplation about the qualifications, again, if that is an appropriate term, of those who can be in God's presence, Psalm 16 is very different. It's a song of trust in Yahweh. David begins with the premise of the entire song. Keep me safe, my God, for in you I take refuge, verse 1. And then this is followed by 3 stanzas. The first stanza has to do with how David knows that he is among the righteous. The second is about how God has blessed David in life. And the third is about how God will continue to bless David after his death. In the first stanza, David describes himself as one who calls Yahweh his Lord, or master is kind of the meaning of the Hebrew word Adonai. This loyalty to Yahweh is shared among all the holy people of God who dwell in his good land. These are Yahweh's faithful. These are not those who have violated the covenant by worshiping false gods in the manner of pagan customs. No, in fact, those who are loyal to Yahweh, they will not even speak the names of those other gods, a line that comes right out of the book of Deuteronomy. Then the second stanza, Yahweh is praised for abundantly blessing David. Yahweh is David's portion, his inheritance, and his cup. Who has favorably drawn the boundary lines of Israel's land allotment and bequeathed David's household in particular with pleasant places and a delightful inheritance. These are terms that are all associated with the land distribution that was given to the 12 tribes of Israel following the conquest of Canaan. And notice also that in addition to granting David's family a good land inheritance, that God has acted as the king's counselor, teacher, and steady guide, verses 7 and 8. David had confidence in life, knowing that his eyes were ever fixed on Yahweh. Finally, we come to the third stanza of Psalm 16, where David is looking at the life to come. Now, the king has confidence that his body will be secure in God's rest, and that Yahweh will not abandon him in Sheol, or the grave, or the realm of the dead. The Old Testament is not always clear about what happens after death. While it does seem that the Israelites believed in resurrection and a life to come, you can see Isaiah 26:19 or Daniel 12:2, and we'll reference some of those passages later, it's really not until the resurrection of Jesus that the doctrine becomes clear. David, however, in spite of his limited knowledge and understanding, was a man of hope. One interesting aspect of Psalm 16 is how it contrasts with an earlier lament, Psalm 6. In that psalm, David had prayed for healing, and he believed that he was near death. So he said to Yahweh, "Among the dead, no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave?" That's Psalm 6, verse 5. Now, we have almost a contradiction here. How can David in Psalm 6 complain about the possibility of dying and tell God, hey, dead people can't worship you, and then turn around and declare his confidence that God will not leave him to rot in the grave forever? I think probably the answer is, listen, that's life. I mean, that's just how life can be sometimes. Sometimes people are up and other times they're down. And one of the beautiful things about the Psalter is that it reflects that swing. In Psalm 6, David is in a low point and he needs God to quickly intervene on his behalf. In Psalm 16, he's got a little more confidence, a little more trust in Yahweh. And so both of these psalms rest beautifully in the Psalter to reflect those ups and downs of life. Now, in Psalm 16, David's confidence in God's presence even after his death is firm. And of course, the power and true import of these words will be used by two great men about 1,000 years after David wrote them. The Apostle Peter quoted this portion of Psalm 16 on the day of Pentecost when he affirmed the resurrection of Jesus, Acts 2:25 through 28. And then not long after that, the Apostle Paul quoted the same exact psalm when he was preaching about Jesus' resurrection in Pisidian Antioch during his first missionary journey, Acts 13, verse 35. Peter and Paul understood the truest meaning and import of David's words. They understood Psalm 16 as a statement of faith in God's power to raise the dead and the certainty of life beyond the grave, which now has become all the more clear and certain after Jesus' resurrected body walked out of his tomb. In anticipation of that life to come, David closed the song by saying, "You make known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand." Psalm 16, verse 11. In the previous psalm, David declared that only those whose lives are blameless, that's the word he used, blameless, can expect to be in God's holy presence. But notice here that in Psalm 16, David has confidence that he's among that number, that he is one of those who will enjoy God's presence. And I find this so helpful because, as one can easily see from David's life, while we could say that the king was always loyal to Yahweh, he was certainly not without sin. David was at times a vile and violent man. But God doesn't expect faultlessness in his servants and his people, only faithfulness. Faithfulness for those who desire to enjoy his presence. Okay, now let's come to our final in this little trio of Psalms, and that would be Psalm 17. Let's read Psalm 17, and then we'll try to make some comments to bring this all together. A prayer of David. Verse 1. Hear me, Yahweh, my plea is just. Listen to my cry. Hear my prayer. It does not rise from deceitful lips. Let my vindication come from you. May your eyes see what is right. Though you probe my heart, though you examine me at night and test me, you will find that I have planned no evil. My mouth has not transgressed. Though people tried to bribe me, I've kept myself from the ways of the violent through what your lips have commanded. My steps have held to your paths. My feet have not stumbled. I call on you, my God, for you will answer me. Turn your ear to me and hear my prayer. Show me the wonders of your great love. You who save by your right hand those who take refuge in you from their foes. Keep me as the apple of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings from the wicked who are about to destroy me, from my mortal enemies who surround me. They close up their callous hearts, and their mouths speak with arrogance. They have tracked me down. They have surrounded me, with eyes alert to throw me to the ground. They are like a lion hungry for prey, like a fierce lion crouching in cover. Rise up, Yahweh. Confront them. Bring them down with your sword. Rescue me from the wicked. By your hand, save me from such people, Yahweh, from those of this world whose reward is in this life. May what you have stored up for the wicked fill their bellies. May their children gorge themselves on it, and may there be leftovers for their little ones. As for me, I will be vindicated and will see your face. When I awake, I will be satisfied with seeing your likeness. Now, much of what we have read in Psalm 17 echoes earlier lament prayers, like Psalms 3 through 5. David begins this prayer with an address to God. He declares his innocence before Yahweh in spite of what others are saying about him. He calls on God for help and deliverance from his enemies. He describes those who sought his destruction as callous, arrogant murderers, and he states his confidence in God's power and ability to help. This is a classic lament prayer. However, the end of this prayer has a twist. Typically, David's laments resolve in praise. That is, he complains, he requests, but he ultimately vows to praise God no matter what happens. While the end of this psalm, Psalm 17, could be described as praiseful, It's more like another statement of confidence. This confidence is not so much in God's power to rescue David from his enemies, but in the knowledge that no matter what happens to David in this life, he will one day be vindicated when he sees God. Notice that David says his wicked enemies have their reward only in this life in verse 14. Through violence and oppression, evil people amass power and wealth. But of course, as Paul says, we brought nothing into the world and we can take nothing out of it. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 7. David, who when he was king was at the height of his power, he was himself a wealthy man. But he did not think of life in terms of temporary material gain. He knew that life with Yahweh is much more than that. And so he says, I will be vindicated and will see your face. Assuming that David had read Deuteronomy, which I think we can confidently affirm that he had, he must have known that no prophet had ever arisen in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face. Deuteronomy 34 and verse 10. Yet David had confidence that he would experience Yahweh as Moses did, or maybe even as Adam and Eve did. And then he says, when I awake, I will be satisfied with seeing your likeness. Now, what does it mean to wake up in this sense? Of course, it's possible that David means he's about to go to sleep, and he knows that God will be with him in the morning when he wakes up. Other psalms give that kind of a sense. But considering the general context of this trio of psalms and their emphasis on being in God's presence, it's possible that David is talking about awakening in the sense of resurrection. Now, we noted earlier that the doctrine of resurrection is not clearly taught in the Old Testament, but there are a couple of passages which seem to allude to it. And these passages also happen to use awakening, waking up, in the sense of rising from the dead. I mentioned these earlier, but now we'll read them. Isaiah 26:19, but your dead will live, Yahweh. Their bodies will rise. Those who dwell in the dust, wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. Or how about this passage in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2? Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. And it seems very likely that Jesus is drawing on this statement from Daniel when he made this statement in John 5, verses 28 and 29. Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done what is good will rise to live, and those who have done what is evil will rise to be condemned. Now, what bearing does all of this have on David's laments and the larger question about being in God's presence? After all, that's really the theme that ties these three psalms together. Well, as we contemplate the meaning of all of this, I want to read from Wilson's commentary. He says, quote, when we look to this world for our satisfaction, we are doomed from the outset to frustration and disillusionment. The author of Ecclesiastes searched far and wide and taught the futility of human endeavor and reliance on wealth, status, and power. The rewards of this world are short-lived and soon left for others to enjoy. Even respect and reputation are fleeting, and Job's quest for divine vindication could not last. But Job, Ecclesiastes, and the author of our psalm all agree, each in his own way, on the only source of continuing satisfaction. Ecclesiastes calls it fear of God, acknowledgement that one is ultimately and completely dependent on the gracious mercy of God. Job lays down his defenses and demands when confronted at last by the undeniable presence of the Almighty. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you, he says in Job 42 and verse 5. Job's response affirms the hope of the psalmist that the righteous will see God's face. and find satisfaction there. Wilson's thoughts here and David's Psalms continue in this walking of the line between the ideal of God's original design and the reality of living life in a world outside of Eden. The goal of humanity is to glorify God. The task assigned to men and women of God is to shepherd, steward, and rule over His creation. But there's a certain expectation that those efforts, as important as they are to God, will only ever be baby steps in the grand scheme of Yahweh's work. If it is God's desire to dwell again with His image bearers, then it will be God's work in the world that will finally and fully accomplish His will. Humans play but a minor supporting role in that effort. And David was careful not to embellish his own importance and accomplishments in life. Worldly people tout their successes, but their reward is only for this life. Godly people do accomplish good things, works for the Lord, but they also recognize that their final vindication will only occur when they, like David, see God face to face. Who can be in God's presence? Psalm 15 says, only those whose lives are blameless. And in Psalm 16, David, as sinful as he was, declared his confidence that he was among that number who was loyal to Yahweh. Death and defeat would not prevent the king from being with God. And finally, Psalm 17 affirms that even in this life, where there may not be satisfaction for the people of God, one day they will awake and be glad, for they will behold Yahweh in all of His glory and splendor. Or as Paul says, Christ died for us so that, whether we are awake or asleep, we may live together with Him. Therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 10 and 11. I pray that the study of these Psalms will be an encouragement to all of the people of God to cling to Him in confidence and love and loyalty. God bless you all, and I hope to see you next time.